this meeting of the Open Caucus. We still have a number of senators that will be coming in, hopefully. But let's get underway. So welcome, everyone, to the Open Caucus, focusing today on the social and economic impacts of robotics, artificial intelligence. I'm Art Eggleton, a senator from Toronto, and my co-chair is Senator Raymond Saint-Germain from Quebec. The Open Caucus is a forum for discussion on issues of national importance. This meeting is co-sponsored by the Independent Senators Group, ISG, and by the Independent Senate Liberals. This is nonpartisan, a nonpartisan discussion, and it's open to all members of Parliament, senators, parliamentary staff, a number of them who are here, plus media and the public. A lot of people in front of me today. Rapid developments in the fields of robotics and artificial intelligence, machine learning, have created the conditions for a new industrial revolution. These technological advancements present opportunities for considerable economic growth while also having the potential to fundamentally change how society is structured and operates. The possibility exists for innovative technologies also to exacerbate social and economic inequalities. Forecasts have projected that up to 50% of current jobs could be impacted by robotics and AI, spanning across all sectors. Repetitive jobs have already been replaced by automation. That's been going on for years, but new jobs have emerged as possibilities for automation, and not everyone will be able to benefit from these specialized professions. For Canada to properly harness its potential, it is imperative that we prepare for policy, legal, and ethical challenges that are raised by the advancement of robotics, AI, and machine learning. Considering that we are living amid this technological revolution, we ask, what steps must be taken to ensure that Canada capitalizes on the advantages of robotics and AI while mitigating the adverse effects? That's what we're going to talk about this morning. On the logistics side, in terms of the meeting, coffee and tea are available at the back of the room. And for those of you in the seats facing me, translation is available, should be at the side of the seats there. And channel 11 will get you the floor, whatever language it's in. Channel 12 is for English, and channel 13 for French. We also encourage audience participation. So if you would like to make a comment or ask a question, we can give you up to 3 minutes at microphone number 5 there, as you can see right in the middle. Up to 3 minutes. Now, if you would let Agnes of my staff know, that's Agnes, she's waving over there. You wave to Joe too. So you let Agnes know, we just need to know, we need to get your name, and if you have an affiliation with an academic institution or with a company or whatever, an NGO group, then please put that on as well. With that, I'll turn over to my co-chair, Senator Raymond Saint-Germain, en français.
Merci, Sénateur Eggleton. Bienvenue, collègues sénateurs et sénatrices. Bienvenue à notre auditoire ce matin. Nous sommes très heureux d'avoir le privilège d'échanger avec 4 panélistes de grande qualité que nous allons vous présenter un peu plus tard. La robotique et l'intelligence artificielle transforment déjà nos vies. Dans les usines pour l'assemblage, dans les entrepôts pour la manutention, dans les hôpitaux pour de nombreuses interventions diagnostiques et chirurgicales, dans les champs agricoles pour cueillir les fruits et même avec certains drones au-dessus de nos centres de détention pour distribuer certains produits illicites. L'être humain a donc déjà créé un espace encore restreint et assez contrôlé pour l'utilisation de l'intelligence artificielle et des technologies robotiques au quotidien. Or, cet espace qui est réservé aux robots est appelé à croître, voire à se confondre de plus en plus avec l'environnement dans lequel nous vivons. Le marché de l'emploi, en particulier, est appelé à poursuivre sa transformation, une transformation parfois trop lente, trop tardive, ce qui représente un défi pour le secteur privé, qui est le principal vecteur d'innovation, mais aussi pour les gouvernements, qui doivent sous-peser les intérêts des forces en présence et la nécessaire adaptation des législations et des politiques publiques. Les implications économiques, sociales, juridiques et éthiques aussi de cet avenir qui n'est plus si lointain, qui est même, quant à moi, un avenir dans lequel on peut se considérer présent, sont à la fois nombreuses et incertaines, mais les panélistes devraient être en mesure de nous faire cheminer dans notre compréhension de ces enjeux, être en mesure de nous aider à restreindre notre espace d'ignorance. Alors, sans plus tarder, je vais vous les présenter, non sans toutefois vous indiquer quelques considérations de nature logistique. Vous avez tous compris qu'il y a du café derrière la salle, vous vous servez à votre convenance. Les services de traduction simultanée sont disponibles. On vous demande d'utiliser le canal 11 pour le plancher et le 12 pour l'anglais et le 13 pour le français. Et donc, nous allons commencer dans un premier temps au niveau de la période des questions à donner préséance aux sénateurs, mais nous allons par la suite alterner. J'ai le plaisir de vous présenter la première de nos panélistes, qui est Kristen Thomason. Elle est professeure de droit, robotique et société. Intéressant, droit, robotique et société, à la faculté de droit de l'Université de Windsor. Elle termine sa thèse de doctorat en droit qui porte sur les drones et la protection de la vie privée dans l'espace public à l'Université d'Ottawa. Kristen effectue des recherches et écrit sur les incidences juridiques, sociales et éthiques de la robotique et des machines autonomes. Avant d'entreprendre son doctorat, elle a été auxiliaire juridique auprès de Madame la juge Rosalie Abella à la Cour suprême du Canada. Et elle a aussi été auxiliaire juridique pour la Cour du banc de la Reine de l'Alberta et stagiaire en droit pour le ministère de la Justice de l'Alberta à Calgary. Alors, Kristen, tout cela nous donne vraiment beaucoup envie de vous entendre. La parole est à vous.
Merci beaucoup. Good morning. Good morning, senators and honorable members. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you today and to be a part of this very important conversation about the impacts of AI and robotics. I think that this is a particularly exciting time to be having this conversation about AI and robotics in Canada. As a country, we're already demonstrating our innovation leadership on the world stage. But countries around the world are also working to develop the legal scaffolding necessary to integrate robotics into society and to harness the social and economic benefits of the technology while hopefully mitigating the harms. I believe Canada is well positioned to become one of the world leaders in this legal realm as well, but we need to take some steps to get there. So as you heard, I'm a law professor and a lawyer. I'm not a roboticist or a computer scientist. I research and I teach law students about the interaction between the legal system and robotic and automated technologies. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about the role of law and our legal system in harnessing the benefits of AI and mitigating the harms. And in my time with you today, I just want to share some observations on the role that I think law can and ultimately must play in developing the Canadian robotics ecosystem and solidifying Canada's position as a world leader in robotics and AI that is socially beneficial. So basically, my main observation on our overarching question for today's conversation, this question of what steps must Canada take to capitalize on the advantages of AI while mitigating its adverse effects, my observation on that question is that Canada can start thinking about legal frameworks that address the social impacts of robotics right now. So in Canada at the moment, we have two areas of robotics-specific law, those dealing with drones and those dealing with automated vehicles in Ontario. And with each of these, the focus of these rules is entirely on physical safety. While safety is incredibly important, and of course we don't want drones falling from the sky or running into airplanes, we don't want autonomous vehicles running into us on the roads, it's time, I think, to start thinking beyond safety as well if we want to ensure that we harness all of the social benefits and mitigate the harms of these and other automated technologies. And let me just start by saying that law is going to play a role no matter what in shaping the trajectory of innovation. Whether the laws are carefully designed or not, but conversations like these will help shape a more thoughtful and helpful legal framework. So for example, what I mean by this, regulatory clarity and permissiveness can promote innovation and investment in Canada compared to, say, preventative laws that entirely prohibit the use of a particular technology or restrict testing in particular ways. or even more so compared to unclear laws that make it difficult to know if a robotic or AI system is or is not permitted. So you may recall when Amazon wanted to start testing its delivery drones here in Canada because the Federal Aviation Administration's rules in the United States were too restrictive and cumbersome. Since then, the United States has shot ahead of us again in drone regulation, and now Amazon is back to testing there. But we also saw this example in terms of the clarity of a regulatory framework fostering innovation and investment with Uber coming to Ontario once the province adopted a legal framework not only permitting automated vehicles on Ontario's roads, but specifying how to get approval and to operate safely. So my main point here is that good, clear laws can generate innovation, and we do not need to wait for the technology to take hold in society before thinking about the regulatory framework. Beyond just fostering innovation, though, law and regulation play a significant role in fostering public trust in robotics, and as a result, in increasing the likelihood of social adoption. So by that, overly permissive rules that might seem great for innovation in the sense of allowing wide experimentation or almost anything to happen can actually backfire when social concerns are not sufficiently addressed. And I think maybe one of the most sensational examples of this is with respect to the privacy concerns associated with drones, where individuals are so perturbed by the lack of privacy regulation or restrictions on privacy invasive uses of the technology that we've even seen a number of stories of individuals shooting at drones, shooting them down. And this is not safe. And this is not good for the social adoption of beneficial uses of drone technology. For example, we would never want to imagine that kind of situation in a search and rescue operation where a drone is being utilized in a positive way. And so I think a lot of everyday people already wonder, how will AI and robotics affect me on a day-to-day basis? And without necessarily being experts in the detailed workings of AI and robotics, or in all of the ways in which AI is already operating in our lives, individuals know that it will be significant and worry about issues like privacy, safety and responsibility, and in particular, I think due process when machines are making decisions about individuals, when we have automated decision making. And I think government law and policymakers, including in the House of Sober Second Thought, have a crucial role to play in thinking through and addressing these social concerns in order to encourage the social acceptance of good robots while addressing some of the negative impacts. And to be honest, when it comes to making laws about robotics, I am much less concerned about the doomsday scenarios that we sometimes see featured in media discussions about artificial intelligence. So by this, I mean the idea that AI is an existential threat to humanity. What worries me more, or most, in my work is that what worries me most in my work is systems that are deployed by well-meaning innovators that unexpectedly have deeply discriminatory implications that were unforeseen or unrecognized because of a lack of oversight, legal oversight, because of a lack of clear responsibility in terms of who's responsible for preventing these issues or fixing those outcomes once they're identified, or because of a lack of guidance in terms of the mechanisms that can be used to prevent those outcomes. And I think all of this can be addressed within a legal framework. So while these doomsday scenarios may inspire regulatory action, which can be positive, I think it's dangerous to let that scenario drive the actual laws that are developed when we need to focus on the real-world issues that are already happening today. So for example, a number of researcher and journalist-driven reports have exposed how historic and modern-day social biases, can be reinforced through artificial intelligence systems that are trained with that biased data. In dealing with this, it's crucial that we develop a legal framework alongside our AI and robotics innovation in Canada to provide guidance and oversight to developers as well as end users of the technology. For example, in regards to requirements for auditing data, for testing, for safety and responsibility, and especially for allowing later public input and feedback. In my remaining moments, I just want to emphasize that I think that the development of this framework will require expertise and training both within government as well as within the judiciary, as each will play a role in determining how Canada regulates artificial intelligence and robotics. It's important for regulators to understand how the technology works and not be diverted by ways in which the technology can seem or act lifelike, but to simultaneously, in the same vein, understand the psychological impact that social machines, those that sound and act and even look like people, can have on the individuals interacting with them. This will require interdisciplinary research and work, and I think the more frequently we can get government and lawyers and lawmakers working in coordination with industry and academic roboticists, the more likely we are to develop the best rules for the public use of this technology. So if we want to harness the social benefits of AI and robotic technology, then I think the time to start thinking about regulation and legal frameworks is right now. Thank you.
Thank you, merci.
Thank you very much. I should point out at this stage that there are two committees of the Senate that have been dealing with the whole question of artificial intelligence, robotics. There is a report on our desks at the moment in the Senate on robotics, artificial intelligence, and 3D printing in the healthcare system. That comes from the Social Affairs Committee. The Transportation Committee is dealing with autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles. So we're into some of this already at those two committees. Our next speaker is Sean Mullen. He's an economist, public policy expert, leader, and thinker. In 2015, he joined the Brookfield Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. It was founding executive director. And for more than a decade, he has championed and shaped important public policy decisions with a particular focus on economic issues. Through his experience, he has become increasingly convinced of the importance of fostering innovation and entrepreneurship as a conduit for economic growth and prosperity. He has also worked as a consultant, providing expertise and advice on business strategy and management to clients in the technology, nonprofit, and public sectors. So welcome, Sean Mullen.
Thank you very much, and very happy to be here. I'm going to take as kind of linked to my background, I'm going to take a lens on this important topic that looks at it through the lens of economics, and particularly the impact on labor markets and Canada's workforce. Just a short background about the Brookfield Institute. We're an economic and public policy institute housed at Ryerson University, and what we try and do is understand the implications and opportunities of technology and innovation for Canada's economy. So just to kick off, we've heard a lot about this topic, robots taking the jobs. It's increasingly a dominant idea in media and otherwise, and as we're here today talking about it. I'd also want to point out that quite a few interesting and prestigious organizations around the world, including, of course, now the Senate, are looking at this topic. The Obama White House, the McKinsey, University of Oxford, OECD have all done some really interesting work in the last couple of years on the impact of automation and artificial intelligence on the workforce, and I'll reference a few of these things in the study. I'm not going to kind of cover the technology side. I think other panel members are probably better equipped to doing this. But essentially, if you look at this from the lens of an economist, what you're talking about is the substitution of work by technology. This is not necessarily a new thing, but as technology is always changing, particularly with the rise of advanced robotics, machine learning, deep learning, other types of technologies, the way in which that substitution is occurring is changing, and so I think that's what that's one of the lenses to look at this topic. So a report that we did last year called "The Talented Mr. Robot: The Impact of Automation on Canada's Workforce." We took a methodology that had been pioneered by a couple of professors at the University of Oxford, Frey and Osborne. They were one of the first to convene a group of machine learning and artificial intelligence experts and to look at the impact of those technologies, not trying to predict the future of where those technologies might go, but literally what technology is possible today and what portion of work activities could be replaced by technology. And they used that to project forward to the US economy and did that at kind of all the occupation level for the US economy. We took that work, crosswalked it to Canada, and adopted the methodology for Canada's workforce. Some of the high-level results that we found: 42% of all occupations within Canada, all jobs, fall within this bucket that we call a high probability of high risk of being impacted by automation. That doesn't necessarily mean that all those jobs are going to be lost, but the way I think about it is some of them might be lost, but some of them will likely be significantly impacted or changed in some way, and that's over the next 10, 15 years. Just breaking down this component, the high-risk category, average income in that category is half of the low-risk category, so you're starting to see low-wage jobs emerge. And the next piece is if you look at kind of educational attainment, 1/3 the education, post-secondary education attainment rate in the high-risk category versus the low-risk category. So you're starting to see emerge, not exclusively, but a phenomenon that's likely to disproportionately impact low-income workers, low-educated workers relative to the population writ large. Another way to kind of break this up is to look at it not from an occupations perspective, but rather the component tasks that go into a particular job. McKinsey took an approach in 2016 that looked at kind of all the 2,000 tasks that comprise all the jobs in the US economy and kind of aggregated that up to occupation codes. Found a very similar result for Canada. Actually, 42% of all work activities are at risk. And if you start to look at things from a task perspective, it's repetitive, non-cognitive, routine jobs like data collection and data processing that seem to be most at risk. Creative, non-predictive, highly cognitive, unpredictable jobs like managing stakeholders, human interaction, even unpredictable physical work like being a plumber tend to be tasks that are least at risk under this framework. We also then took this methodology, and earlier this year we released another report that kind of looked at the geographic implications. So we mapped the jobs, tasks, and occupations at risk to the census metropolitan areas and census agglomeration areas across the country. That's about 83% of Canada's labour market. You can't really drill down into some of the more rural areas because the data doesn't exist there. And what we were able to find is this is the McKinsey data as well. From a sector perspective, you're looking at areas like accommodation, transportation, and warehousing, manufacturing being at the very high end of the risk, whereas education services, information, cultural technology, professional services tend to be at the bottom end of the risk profile. Mapping that onto Canada's geography, so you can kind of find an interactive website on our website here. It's a Google Maps layer where you can kind of zoom into every census metropolitan area, and we're able to kind of create kind of an at-risk index in terms of whether a local economy is more or less susceptible based on these aggregate kind of numbers. Not surprising, mid to small municipalities that tend to be less diversified and tend to be focused in one or more areas of the economy that are at high risk. For example, the oil sands with Wood Buffalo or Ingersoll, for example, in southwestern Ontario. Those tend to be areas geographically that are most at risk for these types of disruptions. A few kind of closing slides that reference a more general context and more backwards looking. This is a Brookings chart of the U.S. manufacturing sector. 1980, it took 25 jobs to generate $1 million in economic output. Today, it takes 6.5 jobs, and that's adjusting for inflation. So you're looking at 1/4 of the jobs for the same amount of output. And the U.S. manufacturing sector has actually been growing from an output perspective, but just not a jobs perspective. So good from a productivity perspective, not necessarily good from a job growth perspective. Another study that kind of backs this up, two MIT economists looked at the impact of industrial robots, so very specific, not the broader technological suite of artificial intelligence, but literally just industrial robots between 1990 and 2007, and saw the introduction of one industrial robot in a particular geographic area resulted in the decline of 6 jobs, and that's kind of controlling for trade and other type of regional variations. One perspective I think that's important on this debate is historically technology has been the greatest wealth creator essentially for modern economies. So 100 years ago, about 1 out of every 2 jobs in Canada was working on the family farm. That has declined to less than 2% today, and yet output from our agriculture sector has gone up by more than a factor of 10. So that's an unqualified good thing. We're producing way more with way less, creating way more economic activity and value and wealth for Canada, and yet the aggregate levels of employment over that period have also been increasing. So as kind of closing thoughts, I think the way to enter this debate is how to balance the positivity with the negative implications. So in the short term, you're talking about potential workforce disruption and worker displacement, potentially low income, low skilled workers being displaced. But on the positive side, productivity growth, we have an aging population, opportunities for our firms to be more competitive. Technology has been a source of job creation. And so as we think about this topic, I think thinking about it through these dual lens is the most important way to address it. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And if you can give us a copy or give us a link
Sure.
to your slides so that we can study them a little bit further, that would be helpful.
Happy to.
Merci. I like the expression dual lenses. Very relevant with this issue. J'ai le plaisir maintenant de vous présenter Nicolas Chapados, qui est le directeur de la recherche scientifique à Éléments AI, un laboratoire de recherche appliquée dans le domaine de l'intelligence artificielle. Ce laboratoire a établi un processus systématique pour relier les innovations fondamentales et les applications commerciales. Il est titulaire d'un professeur chercheur Chapados d'un diplôme en ingénierie de l'Université McGill et d'un doctorat en informatique de l'Université de Montréal. Il a fondé avec Yojoa Bengio en 2001 Abstat Technologies, qui est une firme de transfert de technologie dans le domaine de l'apprentissage machine qui applique des idées découlant de la recherche universitaire de pointe à divers domaines, dont l'évaluation du risque d'assurance, la planification de la chaîne d'approvisionnement, les prévisions opérationnelles, la défense nationale et la gestion de fonds spéculatifs. Je pourrais allonger pendant 10 minutes. Je préfère vous laisser la parole. Alors, à vous, M. Chapados.
Un grand merci. Messieurs les sénateurs, mesdames les sénatrices, bonjour. C'est un grand plaisir de pouvoir vous parler aujourd'hui. As you may know, Element AI was created just 1 year ago. We celebrated our first anniversary exactly 2 weeks ago. And during this time, we grew from about 8 people to close to 200 people today. So from this perspective, I do not want to claim that I can cover the broad angle of the economic impact of AI and robotics because we are relatively new players in the ecosystem. But I want to share what I think is a rather unique perspective from working directly with large organizations on enabling AI and automation. I think that these points of view will be complementary and also echo some of my fellow panelists today. So Element AI works with large organizations, both corporations and governments, to help them plan and implement a transition to a world where more and more of their operations will run on AI. This transition means a lot of different things depending on the organization. But unfortunately, the first images that come to mind when we talk about an AI transformation are sort of the Hollywood level or the magazine level view of AI, of a world in which Skynet is taking over, for example, or in which robots will automate us all away into meaninglessness. From an economic perspective, we hear statistics such as what Dr. Mullen talked about, such as from 8 to 10% of jobs being fully automatable, or how 50 to 70% of jobs could be partially automated. It is undeniable that there will be displaced jobs, and we will come back to that in a minute. But from our vantage point and what we are seeing in the market today, it seems very clear that the benefits and the upsides to individuals and to society will far outweigh the risks and the discomfort that will come from the change. In particular, we have to understand that AI is not about automating jobs away. It is about automating individual tasks. And this is not only a semantic distinction. So to a large extent, what we see is that automation will increase the demand for the skills and the capabilities that are uniquely human. For example, human judgment, problem solving, social and emotional capabilities, providing expertise, coaching, and developing others. We are nowhere close to having AIs and robots that can do these things today. In a nutshell, automation could make the work environment more complex, harder to organize, and with workers and managers spending more time on coaching, and with AI that would take the role of the repetitive and mind-numbing activities. So there is indeed a very good report by McKinsey Global Institute that suggests that 60% of occupations will have at least 30% of automatable tasks using today's available technology. Think about it, 60% of jobs have at least 30% of tasks that are automatable. Even 25% of the tasks of CEOs are automatable, okay? But when I speak with CEOs, I tell them that they will soon enjoy 25% more vacation time, and they all start laughing. They don't believe me. They all know that they are not going to enjoy more vacation. They know that their work will shift. They will be doing different work, but not less work. So the headline debate is often framed in terms of cost reduction, mostly through the elimination of labor. But what we see in the market and when speaking with clients, they are more interested in the value that automation can deliver and that is unassociated with labor substitution. Things like getting closer to customers, improving industrial operations, optimizing knowledge work, increasing the scale and the speed of discovery and R&D, those are all top-of-mind concerns of the CEOs that we speak with every day. And let me tell that a top-of-mind concern is not about cutting workforce. So in this context, we need really to think about the symbiotic relationship between AI and work. And I would like to offer two concrete examples on this. So the first example is about a Montreal-based startup called Imagia, which I had the pleasure to co-found 3 years ago. And Imagia develops AI tools to automatically analyze medical images and as well as other patient medical data in order to detect and diagnose cancer tumors. So in particular, Imagia is very close to the commercialization of a model that can watch videos of optical colonoscopy and in real time propose a diagnosis about whether certain lesions on the colon wall that are called polyps are benign or malignant. So this is a task that used to take about 2 weeks to a pathology lab in the hospital to do, and it can now be done in real time within a colonoscopy examination. Since last year, we have been showing prototypes of this technology to gastroenterologists at conferences all across the world, and the uniform reaction is, this is amazing. When can you get this available? When can you get this done? I want to use it. They know, so the gastroenterologists are not afraid of losing their job. They are welcoming this technology with open arms. And they know that it will help them make better professionals, not redundant professionals. The second example that I want to offer is about white-collar automation. So at Element AI, we have been having numerous conversations with investment managers in the financial sector. And for quite some time already, the job of portfolio allocation and portfolio optimization has been fully automatable. This is not something that has become available only in the past couple of years. This is something that we know how to do for at least a decade. But at many funds, this is still a highly manual activity that is still done by people who want to become intimately familiar with the companies that they will invest in. So they come to us to help with a specific problem, which is that every morning they are drowning under hundreds of reports that are sent to them overnight by research outfits, and perhaps some senators here can relate to the flood of information that is filling the inbox every day. And unfortunately, nobody has time to read all of those reports. And yet, for many of those portfolio managers, one report may contain the nugget to a very nice new investment idea. So they are looking to AI tools, and in particular natural language processing tools, that will help them put the most relevant nuggets of information at the top of the pile, so that instead of having to plow through hundreds of reports, they can get the top reports at the top of the list, the reports that best align or most contradict some of their existing investment positions, so that they can give more thought and more reflection to the news reports that are coming in every day. So in other words, they want AI to sort out and organize knowledge, knowing that it will make them more effective. So from these examples, as well as many that we come across every day, we have come to the conclusion that the best way forward is to embrace AI and learn to adapt it, understanding that the design of some of our social institutions will need to change. In particular, the most striking example to us is the world of education. If we look at the way that we are teaching our kids today in elementary and high school, the vast majority of the curriculum is very, very similar to the way curricula were built 20 or 30 years ago. But the reality of the job market is that for the next 50 years, somebody who is graduating from high school today will get a job market shifting under his or her feet every 3 or 4 years. There will be no guaranteed job security, and people will learn to adapt, and become really adept at lifelong learning. We need to give the students today the tools to deal with that. And we also need to rethink our social institutions to make it possible. Our social safety net that encourages lifelong learning for individuals. If we believe that if this is done correctly, every person can enjoy more fulfilling lives and fully realize their human potential. And if all of this is done right, AI, automation, and robotics ultimately offer us the potential to make us more human instead of irrelevant. Thank you.
Well, thank you. None of our speakers have yet suggested that senators should be replaced by robots, but we have one more. We have Goldie Nejat, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Mechanical and Industrial Engineering at the University of Toronto, and the founder and director of the Autonomous Systems and Biomechatronics Laboratory. Dr. Nejat is also an adjunct scientist at the Toronto Rehabilitation Institute and is a world-renowned expert in developing intelligent service personnel robots for applications in health, elderly care, emergency response, search and rescue, security and surveillance, and manufacturing. A major goal of her research is to develop and integrate intelligent, socially assistive robots for assistive human-robot interactions in healthcare facilities, private homes, and for high-stress and dangerous jobs. Dr. Nejat's research is leading the development of intelligent assisted robotic aids that can meet the challenges posed by an aging population.
Thank you, Senator Eggleton and Senator St. Germain, for inviting me to speak at this open caucus meeting. Good morning, members of the Senate and the audience. My discussions this morning will provide my point of view as a robotics researcher, in particular a robotics researcher that develops intelligent robots for everyday life, including at the home, as well as in the workplace. As we all know, there's currently a robotics race going on. Across the world, both governments and industry are driving this robotics revolution. And this is through significant investments in both talent and technology. We can no longer say the robots are coming. They're actually already arriving. And the question now is, what is our role in Canada within this robotics revolution? We already know Canada's home to a number of leading innovators in robotics technology, in particular in applications in healthcare, manufacturing, service, as well as space, just to name a few. We have the people, the expertise, as well as the drive to succeed in this robotics race. What we're really missing from this recipe is a national robotics strategy or plan, similar to the one that the US, Japan, China, Korea, and the European Union already have. We need similar government-based initiatives, as well as funding here to foster Canadian innovations that will directly have health, economic, as well as social benefits. In my opinion, the investments should be threefold. First, we need investments in research and development of these robotic technologies. We need investments for training of both the existing as well as the future workforce, as well as investment into the integration and use of robotic technology in society. I'm excited to say just about 2 months ago, there was a number of us, leaders in robotics research and development across academia as well as industry, that met in Vancouver with government agency representatives as well to discuss initiating or really organizing a committee to put together or put forth this Canadian robotics initiative. And we're planning to also have a follow-up meeting in Toronto in April. And we want to really design the strategic plan to ensure Canada's role in this robotics revolution, as well as, of course, to accelerate the development of robotic technologies that can help our society. This past spring at the University of Toronto, we also had our own committee meeting in order to generate our own robotic strategic plan for the next 5 years, which focuses on the development of the technology, as I was also mentioning, training the next generation of roboticists or entrepreneurs to develop this technology, as well as how we will incorporate this technology into different parts of our everyday life. Similar to previous disruptive technologies, robotics will transform modern society, as we've heard. And along with it, it will bring new auxiliary technologies. If you think back to the automobile, in addition to the development of the car, there was new industries that were created: tires, traffic lights, crossing signs, and so on. And robotics will do exactly the same thing. And if we look at history to see, maybe to help us a little bit to predict what our future will hold, we can look at automation. Of course, robotics has had a long history in industrial applications or manufacturing. And we've seen the use of industrial robots has been more productive and efficient in, of course, assembly lines or in our manufacturing plants, as well as in agriculture. Such increased productivity has led to an increased gross domestic product. So there was a study done in 2015 by Gertz and Michaels that found that the increased use of industrial robots from 1993 to 2007 by 17 countries, mainly in Europe, as well as including the US and Japan, saw an average annual increase of the GDP by 0.37%, as well as labor productivity increase of 0.36%. If you want to put that into perspective of what that means, this gain is estimated to be similar to how steam technology transformed the labor productivity growth in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So now, kind of moving from industrial robots, we're seeing robots in a lot of different applications, right? Coming right from the manufacturing floors into our homes and other workplaces. This has been a significant growth in the area we call service robotics. These are robots that are being developed to focus on helping people and supporting people. And this has been really fueled by their ability to aid in addressing some of our existing socioeconomic issues. For example, if you look at healthcare or assistive robotics, especially the ones that we're developing in my group for older care or elder care, the idea here is that these robots are being designed to promote independence of our older population and promote aging in place. Nobody wants to be moving out of their home as they age. They want to be where they feel comfortable and supported. The idea of these robots is that they will help to minimize the burden of care of informal and formal caregivers, support our older adults, as well as provide care to individuals that may be living in remote areas in Canada. Furthermore, these affordable robots can help address increasing healthcare costs, as well as the overall demand that's put on our healthcare system. So for example, if you think of Mrs. Smith living in rural Ontario, she loves living in a small town, but her children live across the country in British Columbia, so they can't frequently visit her. Mrs. Smith has mild cognitive impairment. This causes her to usually forget some of the steps in completing activities of daily living. So input Casper, the assistive robot. The assistive robot can help Mrs. Smith with these activities of daily living. For example, when Mrs. Smith wakes up in the morning, she needs to brush her teeth or wash her face, but she forgets how to do that. Or she may forget, some of the steps in how to do that, putting, for example, toothpaste on a toothbrush. Casper can assist or prompt Mrs. Smith through these steps to achieving these activities. And sometimes Mrs. Smith forgets to eat, or she just is not motivated to eat, so she'll skip meals. Casper can find Mrs. Smith just before mealtime, ask her to come to the kitchen to prepare a meal together. So they can go through the recipe, her recipe book, and decide which meal she wants to prepare. If she forgets where items are located in the kitchen, Casper can point them out to her. And then when they're done completing the meal, Casper can escort her to the dining room, where Casper can also monitor what she's eating in terms for nutrition, as well as if her eating habits are changing. So this is great because it provides assistance for somebody who wants to stay in their house. As I mentioned, Mrs. Smith's children are across the country. The nice thing about Casper is that Casper can also connect the two of them together. So through video conferencing using Casper's tablet that can be embedded on its chest, the robot can connect Mrs. Smith and her family members, and Mrs. Smith doesn't have to do anything. She doesn't have to find her tablet, she doesn't have to turn on the tablet, remember to charge it, or even to start the software that does this. Casper can do this all for her. So this is the future of home care robotics, where personalized assistance can be provided to match the needs of a specific user. I move on to my second point in terms of training, we need to start early in training both the current and future workforce with the skills and expertise needed to complement working with and alongside robots. Our own research with older adults, family members, as well as caregivers has shown that they all see the benefits of using this technology and look forward to using it as long as there's proper training to use the technology. With the general progression of technology at a pace faster than ever before, as my colleague was mentioning, lifelong learning is important. Throughout our careers, we're going to need to learn and continue to learn to adapt to what's happening, changes at work as well as changes in society. Training is the most important key to successful adoption of robotics technology by our workforce. As a country, we also need to raise public awareness of robotics and the potential benefits of this technology to aid in solving societal problems. Our future consists of people living and working with robots, each complementing the other, where the whole, robots and humans together, is greater than the sum of the parts. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I was going to ask you, if Mrs. Smith wants a glass of wine, will Casper go get it for her, or will the doctor control Casper? Well, anyway, don't answer that. But,
If I may, I have another question. Combien de langues parle Casper? Is he multilingual?
So that's a great question, and yes, we're designing our robots to be multilingual, yeah.
Okay, well, there's our panel input, and now it's time for a dialogue between the panel and senators, and we welcome the audience to be. We've got already a half a dozen senators down on the list, so we can probably get it maybe 3 people or so. We'll get as many as we can from the audience, but the sooner you let Agnes over there know, the better. So with that, let's start with Senator Gold. And we'll have to deal with one question each to make sure we can get through all of this. You could do it, you can have subparts, but try to get one.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming here. This is fascinating. When I say it's a brave new world, I don't mean that in the literary sense, if you'll allow me that. And perhaps offline we could talk about search and rescue, because the Fisheries and Oceans Committee is engaged, of which I'm a member, engaged in a very important study on marine search and rescue. And I'm sure we have something to learn from you. Talking about technology and all of that, you might find it surprising that I think this really underscores the importance of the humanities and the social sciences. And I worry, a little bit about a rather instrumental approach, not that you're taking, but that we tend to take on these things as if all that we need to do is train people in technology. I think you've raised questions that go to the heart of what it is to be a human. And philosophy and, dare I say, religion, I think, remain important in all of this. What does it mean to have a productive, non-meaningless life? But also, it shows in more particular the challenges for law. And so let me cite one example and perhaps ask for your comments, and I'll leave the rest of it, because I could go on forever. There's a famous philosophical problem, the trolley problem, that Judith Jarvis Thompson said. You're adapted to automated vehicles. You're driving your vehicle's driving you down the road, and all of a sudden there's a parent and a child in a trolley, and you can swerve, or you're going to hit the. Now the algorithm that's been programmed will do something. Now, should it swerve if it's only going to hit and kill one person? In other words, and so what is the ethical and legal responsibility? How does the law deal with these ethical and philosophical choices, which philosophers haven't really sorted out? They're perennial. They'll be embedded in algorithms and therefore in notions of personal or collective responsibility. How are we going to deal with human agency and responsibility when these ethical decisions are now going to be embedded in machine language?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. If I may jump in on that and make further comment to my other panelists. And maybe this is best left to my other panelists as well, but in response to the trolley problem, something that I've heard more and more in the dialogue around that issue is that ultimately the technology, by the time it's on the roads, will actually be so advanced that we won't end up in a trolley problem situation, because it will be at the state where it can avoid it. So this is sort of the response, the engineering response that I've heard to the trolley problem question. And if that's true, that's fantastic. And I think that will be important in terms of setting basic safety standards. What kind of situations do we want to, are we willing to accept as permissible before sort of allowing the full deployment of the technology? But I think, regardless of the state of the technology, the problem that you raise still highlights important questions. And that's, to me, it comes down to this idea that with robotics, we actually have an opportunity, because of the state of the technology, the ability to sort of forecast where it's going to be in the coming years, and our ability to have a social dialogue now before it's out on the roads in the case of automated vehicles, or in the skies in the case of drones. We have the opportunity to have public dialogue and discussion about what we want from our technology before it's fully designed and before it's sort of taken hold in a way that it can be difficult to change later. And I reference that, I would make the analogy back to the vehicle, the non-automated, the human-driven vehicle, where cars were developed and designed by innovators, by technologists, in certain ways without the role of the law and without public input necessarily in the design. And then throughout the history of the vehicle, you see massive casualties, road casualties, that weren't prevented until the 60s, when law really started to get involved and regulate design in addition to the use of the technology. So I think with robotics, we have this exciting opportunity to flip that order and have the public discussion now. And so I think that's where, thinking about what types of regulatory regimes do we want in place beyond just safety, but also ethics, morality, decision-making, oversight, and responsibility for the programming. Have that conversation now and come up with the rules for design as well as for the use of the technology. That opportunity exists right now, and we should be talking about that. And so whether or not the technology will actually be so highly skilled that it will avoid all trolley problem situations, I think the fact that we can sit down and think about how much responsibility do we want to give to programmers, and how are we going to audit what work is done, how are we going to continue to enforce oversight once the technology is out on the roads. These are the questions we can actually start answering now.
Okay. Is there anybody else in the panel wants to add to that? Okay.
Sénatrice Pouvait.
Thank you. This has been very interesting, and thank you for your input. As Senator Eggleton said, the Transportation Committee has been working very hard on autonomous vehicles, and while I'm fascinated with Mrs. Smith and Casper, it does relate to some of the questions that we've been having at Transport, dealing with issues of privacy. And you mentioned privacy. I'm really concerned about security of personal data. And as some of you know, sort of a car I rented this summer, we plugged in my daughter's phone and ended up with everybody's mailing list who'd rented the car before me. So from that point on, we used her phone, not mine. But I found that very disturbing, and I know nothing about robotics. I'm certainly not a technological expert by any means. But when we take a look at that and we talk about the need for regulations, I'd like your thoughts on how do we tie this in to protect individuals, whether it's Mrs. Smith and her how many glasses of wine Casper's been providing to her, and what about the privacy within the vehicles? So can you give us a sense of that balance? Because I think it's an issue that has to be developed at what level, the provincial or the federal level?
So I'll be very brief to leave time for other panelists as well. I think there are a couple of considerations there. The first is that we can be thinking about technology-specific regulation and also technology-neutral regulation. And what I mean by that is we might need to be thinking about how do we deal with privacy, security, hacking, information that's stored within autonomous vehicles specifically, and what kind of rules do we need in place to protect that? And then more neutrally, how do we think about privacy generally? What are Canadians worried about when we're moving into a world where our data is increasingly collected and used, maybe in ways that's beneficial, but in ways that can also have detrimental impacts? And I think when we think about it on those two different levels, that's where we start to get into the federalism discussions and what could be nationally regulated, perhaps the technology neutral regulations. We need a rethinking of privacy protection and control. And then on the technology specific side, we might have experimentation at the provincial level or even the municipal level in terms of how we want to deal with those questions. But I'll leave some time for others.
Anybody else want to weigh in on this? No? Yes. Okay. Next then is Senator Joyala.
I think, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate very much your contribution, but I think we should have a philosopher in social sciences also this morning at the table, because if we try to put, the phenomenon of AI and robotics in the context of Western society presently, there is a fracture, and we see it in the States, we see it in Britain, we see it in France. There is a fracture between what I will call, and my friend will excuse me, the white angry man who feel marginalized with the world the way it is evolving. And we've seen it in the election of the President of the United States, the Brexit and whatnot. My perception, and listening to each of you, is that there is no doubt that AI will cause a social fracture of some sort. It will have a major impact in the region, as you mentioned, Ingersoll in Ontario, for instance, what I call mono-industrial small town. Those peoples have not been trained to be on the internet from the age of 18 months to the age you are you. So there will be a chunk of Canadians who will be faced with a situation they won't have the means to handle with. And that will create major social problem in Canada, and it will be I should say, the bed for frustration and a vote of refusal of the world the way it is evolving. And as I say, we've seen it in the States. On the other end, there's another aspect, which is the human factor. A person is it's a social animal. We are social animal. We want to connect with people. And the work of somebody is what structures one's life. We know it. We get up in the morning, we dress up, we take our lunchbox, we go to the factory and whatnot. And as you stated, now you have to put yourself that you are in permanent instability because the job would last 3-4 years. And after 3-4 years, you don't know where you're going to be going, but you will have to leave your job. So do you establish a family? Do you buy a condo with a mortgage? Is your credit card being, watched because in 3 years you won't be able to pay back? All that will happen at the same time. So to think that people have all people have the inbred capacity to adjust to that. You have, because you have, an IQ of 170, that's fine. But not everybody, unfortunately, intelligence has not been distributed equally among mankind. So this is another personal aspect that I think we should not minimize, because we're a legislator. We are here with the responsibility to manage all this. As much as I support what you do, I have no problem with that. But we have to be cognizant of, as I say, the social and human impact of this. So how do we address this in the context of, as you said, the revolution is already on. We're already in the boat on that on the sea horizon. So how do we deal with this?
Okay, who wants to start? Okay, John.
So I don't claim to be a philosopher, but one entry point into what you're talking about is the workforce component, which is some of the angle that we've taken on this. A few interesting data points. Someone did a study right after the U.S. election for the Rust Belt, particularly the manufacturing sector, and found that 85% of all the jobs lost in the manufacturing sector in the U.S. since 2000 have come from automation, and only about 15% came from China. And so we saw China getting the focal point of Donald Trump's attention during that election, but in many cases it was this kind of slow movement towards technology that's been eroding a lot of the, as you said, the single industry towns in parts of that country. So I think it's something we need to think about and take into consideration. I remain kind of in a bigger picture, long-term perspective, an optimist as it relates to technology's potential for humanity. And historically, we've not seen very many periods where aggregate employment has dropped because jobs have been disrupted. But I think the challenge is, as you've kind of alluded to, a particular area, is there are potentially segments of the population that are going to be disrupted, and potentially disrupted in a way that's faster than in previous generations. The kind of evidence of the agriculture sector was it was a generational thing. By the time jobs were lost on the family farm, the next generation had went on to do a different job. So it wasn't the same person losing their job as part of their career. It was their children moving on to do something different. So what do you do with, say, a truck driver who is a good, very good middle-class job in a rural or semi-rural area, doesn't require a lot of skills, maybe 40 years old, and potentially that industry gets wiped out by autonomous vehicles in a period of 5 to 10 years. I think that, from a sociological perspective, is where we need to focus the attention, as opposed to kind of hysteria about the issue at a workforce level. And I think that's where we do need to think about what are kind of adjacent job opportunities. I think there is retraining is a part of this, but in a way that works for those individuals, not, someone who's in the middle of their life or career is not going to go back for a 2 or 4 year university degree. So can we find out from a skills perspective, what's the closest job to a truck driver from a skills perspective that's still in need? Can we upgrade somebody through that process? Can we be mindful of that? Can we start to build that into our training and our industrial strategies so that we're not reacting to the jobs when they're lost, but actually kind of trying to foresee where the opportunities are. So I don't think that solves all of what you've laid out, but I think that needs to be part of the solution.
And will it pay enough to earn a decent living? Okay?
I'll just a brief comment to that. I mean, I agree with your concern about the differential impact of technology on different individuals. That's something that I find deeply concerning. I do research on feminist perspectives on robotic and AI technology, so what are some of the gendered implications, but there are other ways to approach that as well. And I think just in raising that point, we can do an external and an internal consideration. So externally, we need researchers, we need people who are engaged in looking at how can we identify what the differential impacts will be? Can we identify these maybe in advance or as they're happening so that policymakers and lawmakers can start to deal with and address that? And then on an internal perspective, we need to think about who's designing the technology, for what end, for what aim, and with what regulation in mind or what goals in mind, and how can that maybe steer the innovation and direction of technology in a way that will benefit to the greatest extent possible while impacting negatively to the least extent possible the individuals who will encounter that technology. So I think it's a good question.
Nicholas?
So one small point, again, I don't claim to be a philosopher. Are we going to get jobs that stay unchanged for 30 years like it used to be the case? Absolutely not. Those are going to change. And what is different this time is that the speed of change is very quick compared to normal people's career duration. So when it used to be the case that you could retire because an old technology was slowly going away, now you are going to face those issues during your productive life. But I think even there we can learn a lot from history. So for example, there was a time at the beginning of the 20th century where there was again massive disruption in automation's role in greatly improving productivity. And it is by the electrification of the production line. For example, the productivity at Ford Motor Company between about 1913 and 1918 or so increased by many hundreds of percent. The detailed statistics are very comparable to the productivity gains of robotics today that were due at the time to electrification of the production line. And the debate at the time was who should those gains in productivity accrue to? And Ford was quite unique in his perspective that the people working at the factory, labor, should get their fair share of the gains. And every other capitalist of the time, and the debate in the newspapers were that his viewpoint was quite unique. And we remember Ford today for his foresight in seeing that the fruits of increased productivity should go at least in part to the human beings working in a factory. It is time as a society to keep having those debates as well, and who should the fruits of increased productivity go to? And I don't think we have discussed enough the detailed implications of what this would entail on our economic organization.
Goldie?
Thank you. Just maybe something to echo that I think the quality of life of the workers is something we need to consider as well. Looking at the dirty and dangerous jobs, by helping to automate some of these tasks, how are we improving their quality of life? Because in general, some jobs are very high risk, right? And even, that carries on into retirement, the health, the disadvantages through health, whether it's physical or cognitive impairments that come from the job itself. So we need to kind of look at it through a higher lens to see, are we improving the quality of life of the worker? And even though that may displace some of the tasks they're doing, but in general, is it better for them?
Merci beaucoup. Très intéressante réponse à une question très pertinente. Sénateur Monson.
Thank you. I keep thinking of Casper the Friendly Ghost. I can't get Casper out of my head because he was a good ghost, right? He did good things. But with that in mind and serious, I'm curious about how, and you just talked about that, about making it easier for somebody to do their job. And I'm thinking of the caregivers for my late mother here in Ottawa and in Montreal. Poorly paid caregivers, by the way, in our society. But that didn't take away from their warmth and empathy of what they did. So I capture what you're saying about doing the other things, brushing teeth and all that sort of thing. And but a person with dementia, or that's be very difficult. So I'm wondering, where does a robot replace that? Where does a robot replace warmth and empathy that is given each and every day by these caregivers to tens of thousands of elderly people across the country? And the second question would be, we're supposed to be in a paperless society. I always surround myself with paper, maybe because I'm 71, I don't know. But I could hardly carry my briefcase to work. And Nicholas, you talked about the hundreds of reports we have, and you talked about finding the nuggets. Well, I have 7 different issues today, and none are related to each other. So how does a robot figure that out, pull the nugget out and say, Senator, this is what you've been looking for, and it's all there, so go ahead and do it. Thank you.
Sure. Maybe I'll start with the first question. Thank you for that question. I think it's important to note that robots are becoming a part of the care cycle. So they're not there to replace people, but they're there to help with some of the tasks, like we were talking about, repetitive tasks or difficult tasks for the caregivers, so that the caregivers can focus on the higher level interactions, as you were mentioning, right? The social communication, the warmth that they give. But there are some repetitive tasks that they even found very difficult. So before we even deploy these robots, we do a lot of focus groups with caregivers, family members, as well as older adults to see really what are the tasks that they would want to see automated. And a number of times it becomes a repetitive task. For example, if we go back to the Mrs. Smith scenario, and we bring that maybe into long-term care where there's now 30 Mrs. Smiths, and you have, for example, 3 people caring for them, and they're all eating a meal at the same time, and you need to give them each, the care or the prompting that they need to finish their meals, for example. And it's a very repetitive task because you can have a robot come in there and, do the prompting. Please, pick up your fork. Please eat. Take some food with your fork and so on. So those repetitive tasks can help them because then they're not running around trying to make sure 30 people are eating, right? And these 30 people may have different levels of cognitive impairment, for example. And so when we're designing this technology, we're not seeing it's just the technology. As I was mentioning before, it's the humans and the technology together and working together to improve not only the quality of life of the older adults that they're assisting, but as well as the caregivers, that emotional and physical burden that's on them as well.
As to the second part of the question, one of the big progress in AI over the past couple of years have come from a subfield called machine learning. And in a nutshell, machine learning is about how the computer can learn from a large number of different examples that is provided to it. So if we could codify and give examples to the machine of which documents and which nuggets of information within those documents you personally find interesting in your morning readings, then with time the machine could learn to identify those bits of information. And in particular, we have been working with an investment firm, for example, that has all of their human analysts digitally highlight the areas in a document that they find interesting. So we have data for all the yellow highlights that analysts have found interesting in documents as they were reading them, and now we can train a model to automatically highlight for new documents that have never been seen before, but that mimic the highlighting style of individual people. So we could train a model to highlight, to mimic your personal highlighting style, for example.
Et pour conclure sur cette question, Monsieur Mullen.
Just one very quick point on your first question about the caregivers. I was actually talking to a senior hospital executive about the issue of automation in the healthcare sector. And she had kind of said, look, is this a bit of a paradox? Everyone is saying we need more automation to keep costs down, and yet there's a ton of clinical evidence that in-person care both has a tangible and intangible benefit on patients. And I kind of said, well, that's not necessarily contradictory. An economist would say, if you reduce the cost of the routine-oriented tasks, relatively speaking, you'll be able to put more value on the part of the task or a job that is not routine-oriented. And so freeing up more of people's time to do that in-person care and allow the actual tasks that underlie the caregiving could be a way of actually having better outcomes at less cost and freeing up more those front workers to actually do the human interactions that are needed to help patients.
Okay. I'll go to Senator Calvez, and then after that, we'll go to the floor.
Thank you. As you can see, most of the questions are going to the same subject. I am an engineer, and I'm a geek. I like technology. I remember when finishing my background, they say, oh, we come with the computers, we won't need engineers anymore. That's what they say. It's, oh, wow, you know, I'm disruptive. I won't be able to find a job. I have job up to here. So I like the fact that technology evolves and brings all these good things. But technology is neutral. Technology is not positive or negative. Technology is neutral. It's a tool. What we do with this technology, that's what makes, is it beneficial or is it a problem? I can make a parallel of this disruptive industry of AI with genomics, okay? So, or with biochemical weapons. So a drone can go and deliver assistance to a place, but it can also drop drugs or shoot, and nobody will be implicated. So after hearing you, I'm fascinated that how far we are going with technology. But unfortunately, I feel that we are still working in silos. And I thought in research, we don't work anymore in silos. We have to work together. So the economy influences your robotics, and your law influences the applications in social science. And definitely I agree with Senator Royal saying that we need somebody in the odontology and not philosophy, I don't know, I think it's the odontology. Somebody that thinks about when the technology is going to be used for good and when it's. Because our responsibility doesn't stop in our lab. I work in a lab. I know what's a lab. But my responsibility cannot just, okay, develop this, and I put it there into a market, and they do whatever they want with that. And I don't think bills are at the end, you know, let's control. We have to control ourselves as long as we develop. So my question is, do you have a space in your silo to work with other people?
Okay, Kristen will start.
I absolutely think that interdisciplinary, not siloed work is what's going to bring us the best results, both in terms of the technological innovation and then also in terms of the regulation. And I would suggest that regulation doesn't have to be after the fact. I think it can come before, and we can be thinking about it early in the development phases of new technologies, and particularly in regard to the technologies we're talking about today. And I would just, I guess, say that in relation to the idea that technology is neutral or not neutral. There are ways in which technologies can actually reflect certain politics or certain social possibilities or feasibility. And so a famous example in philosophy is the idea of a bridge, and the height at which it's built might allow for the passing of public transit underneath that bridge, or might prevent the passing of public transit so that only people who own cars are capable of using that highway system. And so that's an example of something, a bridge that would seem very neutral, actually exhibiting deep politics and having a significant impact on human affordance or human capability. And I think we can look at the ways in which robotics and AI technologies might do the same. And I think that your point that we need to do this without the silos, we need social scientists, philosophers, lawyers, and technologists working together, is the only way we're going to be able to identify these issues in advance and ideally, hopefully, prevent the so to speak, building of bridges that prevent social access to the benefits of the technology. So I think that that's a very important point.
Sean?
So I would totally agree with that. I skipped over this a little bit in my intro, but the Brookfield Institute, the institute that I run, we created it a couple of years ago. And the idea was we need a spot to kind of bring an understanding of the economic and social implications of technology and innovation for Canada. And so my background is economics, but we routinely bring in people from across the spectrum, whether it's technologists or other backgrounds. In fact, a colleague of Nicholas's from Element AI is on an expert panel we're pulling together. So I 100% agree, and I'm already a believer in what you are speaking, that we need to do this across silos.
So it is occasionally said that a model is an opinion embedded into mathematics. So there is neutrality in technology up to a certain extent. When we create a model, we need to train it on some data, and the choice of that data reflects the biases of the people who construct the model. I don't think we can totally evacuate the idea that there are deep fairness issues and deep political, up to a certain extent, issues that go into even deploying the technology. And this is why we think about the interplay between the technology and the way it is deployed pretty much all the time when we think about models. So we ask questions about how the data has been collected. Is it the reflection of existing human processes that the AI will just perpetuate, or it reflects some objective truth or some objective reality of nature that we might be comfortable with repeating? And from technology, we have techniques like algorithmic fairness, for example, where we can guarantee that a model is unbiased by certain variables that we don't want to be exposed to. But then, is there a mandate from government or regulatory bodies that the practitioners of those models actually are forced to use these tools from technology to make the models more fair? So those are all questions that we need to ask. We ask them all the time, but there is certainly a role for regulation to at least make sure that people who will put out models impacting people's lives develop it according to state-of-the-art techniques.
Actually, that's a great point you made, because I teach this to my graduate students in robotics, that I totally agree with you that technology is neither good or bad. It's neutral, and it's up to us as developers or users or policymakers or stakeholders to take that technology and apply it however we want. And based on that, if you're thinking about it, maybe going back to the wine, Casper delivering a glass of wine to Mrs. Smith, it depends who Casper, let's say who owns Casper? Is it Mrs. Smith who owns Casper? Maybe it's her family. Is it a healthcare robot that's been, deployed in her house, and so the doctors or healthcare professionals are in charge, so they'll say, well, Mrs. Smith cannot have any wine at all, and the robot won't get her wine. And if Mrs. Smith owns the robot, maybe, she may get more than 1 or 2 glasses of wine. So it really depends, as you were saying, who is in charge in terms of all the way from the beginning, and making sure that the developers are a group of people, not just the engineers or computer scientists, but the social scientists, the psychologists, and if you're looking at health, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, doctors, and so on, that are involved right at the beginning and developing this technology, so that we're looking at all the different possibilities in its use at the end. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go to the floor, and microphone number 5 is for this purpose, and you have up to 3 minutes to either make comments or pose a question to the panel. So, I'll take a couple now. Michael Burt, who's an automation engineer. He's with Iridian, which is the name of a company.
Hello. So I'm going to apologize first, because what I'm about to say, I guess, is it's been repeated, and many of the senators have kind of said the same thing, but it has to do with judgment in technology. But I promise you at the end there will be a clear and poignant question. So, so just some context on myself. I'm an automation engineer. I've worked in fields like telecoms. I've worked in research. I've literally worked in industrial automation where I've seen jobs been replaced. I've done automation upgrades at water treatment plants, excuse me, even a gold mine once. So that's just a bit of background on me. In school I studied electrical engineering, and I took courses in machine learning. There was an artificial intelligence course, but in my personal opinion, I don't really think it resembles what many people think of when you say the words artificial intelligence. So that's just kind of my background. And the preface to my question kind of has to do with the state of the technology. And so when we say machine learning right now, it's a set of algorithms that are kind of embedded in transistor computer technology, which kind of tends to be finite, and it's ones and zeros, and it's the technology that exists in our cell phones and our laptops and any computers. But my question is there an effort being put forth to study the effects of quantum computers and quantum technology if they come to fruition, and if the machine learning algorithms get applied to technologies like those?
Okay. Okay, Nicholas?
So, quick attempt at that answer. You're right that there has been massive progress in quantum computing over the past few years, and I'm by no means an expert on the topic. But we do have experts in Canada, in particular at the Perimeter Institute, close to Toronto. And there are efforts to apply machine learning to quantum computing. In particular, this year at a startup incubator associated with the Rotman School of Management at University of Toronto called Creative Destruction Lab. For many years, the Creative Destruction Lab had cohorts of machine learning and AI startups. And for the first time this year, they are hosting a cohort of quantum machine learning companies. So the awareness is spreading in that direction. Now, the reality is that all those companies are quantum ready, in a sense, in that they are deploying technology and processes that will be able to take advantage of quantum computers when they become available. But today, the capabilities of quantum computers is not just there to realistically tackle problems in the same way that classical computers can, especially machine learning problems.
Okay, thank you. Next, one more I'll take at this point, and then I've got 2 more to take later. Matt LeMay, LSCI Consultancy in Artificial Intelligence Deployment.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. My name is Matt LeMay, and I work for LSCI, a consultancy that specializes in the rapid deployment of artificial intelligence solutions for government and private clients. For context, our clients are in human resources, real estate, food safety, and medical devices, all very human categories. Before I ask my question, it sounds like there are multiple definitions going around the room right now of what automation is. We seem to be evaluating robotics manufacturing versus natural language processing. And Mr. Mullen, you mentioned that automation is a source of substitution of work. And Mr. Chapados, you mentioned that automation can accelerate the execution of work. Although you were discussing these two separate categories that seem to be slightly distant from a semantic perspective, what I'd like to find out from everyone here today is, what are the criteria, in your view, for measuring the impact of employment tenure versus employment opportunities?
Okay. Who wants to start with that? Sean?
Okay, so if I understand your question at the end, employment tenure is kind of length of a job?
The risk of job loss, let's say, versus the opportunities of new jobs.
That's right, yeah. So, okay, really good question. And one of the things I wasn't able to get to in my quick presentation is some of the limitations in the work on looking at the risk of jobs to this technology. So there's certainly a downwards bias, I would say, or a negative bias in some of the work that looks at the impact of automation on workforces, because it only looks at existing jobs, and then it looks at those existing jobs and says what components of those jobs can be replaced by or modified by technology. It's much harder to kind of envision what those jobs of the future might be. One easy example is one of the fastest growing areas of employment for youth is in the area of kind of social media marketing, a job category that didn't even exist 10 years ago, but that technology has enabled. And so that's been the kind of the broad story of technology over history, creating new jobs while displacing existing ones. So kind of trying to get at that upside is harder. Nesta, which is a UK-based organization, just did a paper in September with one of the Oxford professors to look at not just the negative, but potentially the increased demand for job categories based on technological opportunities. Just trying to digest what the implications might be for Canada right now is one of the things we're looking at. So,
anybody else? Okay, thank you.
Merci. Alors, de retour au sénateur, sénatrice Cordy.
Thank you very much, and this has been a most fascinating discussion. I think as politicians, despite all what we said, what we will likely hear most and do now hear most about is loss of jobs and loss of privacy are things that Canadians are very concerned about. I was going to ask questions about the loss of social interaction, but we dealt with that earlier. But my question is sort of along the same lines. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to speak with some teachers who were here for the Teachers Institute in Ottawa, and their concern was the way that the students in their classroom are so tied to their cell phones and their texts, and they find it, they can barely sit through a class because they're not allowed to have access to their phones. And if they hear a beep that they've got a tweet, they just want to look at it. And one teacher told me that she had forgotten to turn her phone off, and the kids heard it, and she just ignored it because she was teaching. And they were like, well, aren't you going to get it? You've got a message, like, aren't you going to check it right now? And she's, it'll wait, I'm busy, I'm teaching, we're talking about whatever it was. She said, I'm going to leave it. So their concern is that the lack of social skills that their students are learning. And teachers teach about collaboration on the one hand, and the need to work together, because in the job market today, it is collaboration in a lot of jobs, working together. And yet, technology is teaching them, maybe not teaching them, but it's a cause that they are becoming more isolated in some ways with the lack of social interaction. So, Mr. Chapados, you in your presentation talked about we must make changes in the way education is done, and that it's likely that students are going to change their jobs many times during their career, or their jobs are certainly going to change. It might be the same company, but their jobs will change. So how should education change? How are we going to teach students to be adaptable within the workforce, adaptable within their jobs, or adaptable in changing careers, but also how are we going to teach them to work collaboratively when this whole side of technology is teaching them to become more isolated?
That's a fantastic question, and education science is not my area of expertise, but a few things that I think are worth thinking about is first, when we look at, and I think Sean talked about it earlier, when we have technology that's automating away the mundane, it means that the cost of the mundane decreases and the demand for it increases. And that also causes all the associated things that cannot be automated to also increase. So we talked about the demand for the things that are uniquely human: judgment, empathy, the ability to socially connect and to have humans relate to one another. So the demand for all those things will most likely increase. So on the one hand, I think we should put a lot of emphasis on teaching more of the social and the social science skills that are useful that will become much more in demand. And on the other hand, to your point about notifications causing our brains to rot, I think it's part of the rigorous training that an early education should bring. We should teach the kids to be resilient and to judge properly the value of those distractions and interruptions. On this last topic of the attention economy, there is a very good briefing in this week's edition of The Economist on the role of social media, both in democracy, but more broadly in the way that it is causing our brains to rot. And that's, in a sense, a little orthogonal to the rise of AI. Those are two independent things. But as humans need to adapt to technology, those are very relevant concerns.
Madame Nejat.
Thank you. I think the teacher actually had the perfect example for teaching, right? It was a lesson there by saying, I'm doing a lesson right now so that the students could learn from the teacher of why you don't have to rush to your phone, things can wait, prioritize. You're learning right now. We're in an interactive setting. But I think just maybe talking about technology, in my own experience, being a professor at a university, I've really realized how it's changed my students in the sense of creative thinking as well as problem-solving skills. They have these technologies, but they're not just looking at them and using them, they're trying to figure out how they work, really trying to reverse engineer them and figure out, if they're having an issue, why is, for example, an app not working, or why is it not working properly? So it becomes a nice element, I think, in terms of what I was mentioning about that learning and the idea of continuous problem solving to figure out why things are made the way they are, how do they work, but as well as with the social media, I think it's a nice element to have because there's two elements to communication. Obviously, the communication of the technical skills that you learn, but as well as communication, to a more general public, whether it be your friends or other people, at the same age group and so on. So I see that also social media has helped them learn how to communicate. Whether it's verbally, while they're doing YouTube videos or whatever it may be, but as well as in a written form to be able to communicate with others. And it's kind of opened up that world for them too. So I see that, you can use it to your advantage. It can help you with some of those hard skills as well as the soft skills that children of the future kind of need, right?
Merci. Monsieur Mullen.
Sure. Just one very quick thing to add to this debate. We did a report earlier this year on kind of the integration of youth into the workforce, given some of the particular challenges that technology and other elements are having. It's a whole different kind of topic, but one kind of related point that kind of touches on here is if you kind of start to unpack the jobs that are least at risk according to some of these methodologies, and then you start to kind of say, well, what are the commonalities of those jobs? You start to come up with a set of skills that some have been talked about here already today: creativity, human judgment, social interaction, also problem solving with technology. So whether that's literally being a coder, but or being someone who's non-technical but can use technology to solve problems. Those tend to come up time and time again. And so our advice is to youth who are kind of maybe going through the post-secondary education system or others, not to try and plan for a career, but to try and acquire a basket of skills that are going to make you resilient to occupational changes. And so we think that's a much better strategy because trying to predict occupations even 5-10 years out is too hard. But if you've got a set of skills that are going to allow you to learn and jump from job to job, that's going to put you much more well positioned for this type of economy.
Merci beaucoup.
Okay. We have one more senator on the list, Senator Meiji. So if any senator who hasn't asked a question or wants to ask a second question wants to go on the list, now's the time. And I do have some more folks from the floor as well. We got about 15 minutes left. Senator Meiji.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je suis toujours très fascinée d'entendre les multiples services que peuvent rendre la robotique, surtout en matière de soins de santé, étant médecin de formation. Au niveau de la colonoscopie, du diagnostic, ça c'est génial, j'y adhère à 100%. Là où j'ai des réserves, c'est le fait qu'on nous vend beaucoup la robotique pour les soins en perte des personnes en perte d'autonomie et en régions éloignées. Si on revient à Mme Smith, quelle serait la forme de Casper, humanoïde ou ordinateur? Parce que si Mme Smith commence à avoir des troubles cognitifs, un humanoïde va la faire paniquer. Est-ce que Madame, avec les troubles cognitifs, pourra savoir comment l'allumer pour qu'elle commence à fonctionner, comment lancer le logiciel pour que ça commence à répondre à chaque acte de la journée, à quel rythme qu'on va lui mettre la cuillère dans la bouche aux 2 minutes alors qu'elle prend 5 minutes pour mastiquer, où est l'économie si on doit avoir, parce qu'il doit avoir une économie à faire d'utiliser le robot, mais si on doit avoir une aide-soignante humaine pour gérer tout ça, est-ce qu'on fait de l'économie? C'est un peu ça qui pourrait répondre à mes réserves.
Let's start with, Dr. Nejad. She's the creator of Casper.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for that question. Embodiment is an important element to designing these robots, and there is a spectrum in the shapes that they come in, as you can kind of see through development of different technologies. Coming from my own personal experience, we don't design robots to look exactly like humans. We don't think that they should look like humans because they're robots, and that's an important element. The main objective of designing them to have, for example, arms or a face is for that natural communication with people, since we are dealing with an older population that may not be accustomed to technology. And in order for them to use the technology, we want to minimize that learning curve, right? So we wanted to have a natural way of communicating with them so that, they can actually use the technology to provide that assistance that they need. I also mentioned this personalization. So we focus on developing robots to provide, and we're really integrated into this idea of person-centered care, where each individual is different. So you were mentioning, What if it takes Mrs. Smith 5 minutes to eat, but the robot prompts her maybe after 2? The robot learns that actually through the interactions with Mrs. Smith to see how long it does take her. It's viewing the scenario, the task, what she's doing in it, and then it personalizes that interaction to provide her the prompts at the appropriate time. And that's the idea kind of through, interaction with the robot continues to learn. So it's not kind of used right out of the box. The robot, that's the nice element of the human-robot interaction, is that the robot keeps adapting to. So if Mrs. Smith, goes from, let's say, mild cognitive impairment to mild Alzheimer's disease, the robot can appreciate that there's a change, recognize that there's a change, and adjust its behavior to adapt to that.
Kristen?
I think the question raises a really interesting point about embodiment, about anthropomorphization, the way we sort of humanize or somewhat humanize our machines, which this is stepping a little bit beyond sort of the question that you asked, but I think raises some important points. There are some legal and ethical questions that come up with this as well. Like, for instance, there's a discussion in sort of the legal, ethical, academic space about the gendering of robots, and how do we decide when we gender a robot to seem or appear or sound like a woman versus a man, even though it's a machine, and what implication does that have in terms of stereotype and bias towards particular occupations or tasks? So those questions come up. But another question that I think actually goes back to your question about privacy as well is the ways in which robots are embodied to seem lifelike or human-like, which can be very advantageous in terms of helping us to interact with them, can also cause a trust phenomenon. So we start to trust the machine in a way that maybe we wouldn't otherwise, and share information with it. So we see this with even toys or robots that are used with children, where children are sharing considerable amounts of personal information with a machine, having the psychological impact of thinking, okay, this is like I'm sharing with my best friend. But those norms that, when you share a secret with your best friend, those don't exist when it's turned into data and can be shared beyond that, or used by the company perhaps that's put the machine out into the marketplace. And so I know that this goes a little beyond your question, but I do think that you raise an important point about what are some of the implications of embodiment, and how do we make those decisions about how to make our robots look.
Senator Munson?
Just a brief question before we go to the audience. The words spectrum and silos and personalization struck a chord with me because I work closely with the autism community in this country. And if you were looking for partners to partner, these are brilliant minds, tens, hundreds of thousands of brilliant minds from the ages of 5 to 55 in the autism world. They think differently, they act differently, and they're fascinated by everything that, in terms of the world of technology and newness. And I would just encourage you that I think you would find partners within the autism community across this country of dealing with these brilliant minds, because there'd be a shared purpose and no silos, because in terms of adaptive technologies, and having these people, these wonderful people, live independently, whether it's in a group home. The technology you talked about of doing Casper's work and so on and so forth with another person in that environment, but to have 5 or 6 of these robots, these friendly, empathetic robots, would be a great partnership. So I thought I'd just put that on the record. You don't have to respond, but there you go.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Munson. Let me quickly get a couple of questions in anyway from the floor, because we're just about out of time. So if you can keep it down to about 1 minute in terms of a quick comment or a quick question. Mackenzie Adams, Samanda Consultancy in Innovation and Entrepreneurship.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I will be very brief. One of the focuses that I actually have been working on is smart cities and how they impact emerging markets, so people who don't have access to the type of technologies that we have right now. And one of the questions that I had was, how is it that we are talking about AI, machine learning, and robotics, yet the infrastructure isn't really moving forward to accommodate this yet? We know that within the next 10 to 15 years, the landscape's going to be completely different. And also, how does that impact not having what we would now coin smart schools, where we're, in a sense, accelerating learning so that we can accommodate the demands for, I guess, more knowledgeable workers who are no longer low-skilled as we would have it? And would that be something that we would want to look at, where post-secondary education is provided free of charge, as we would with public schools for primary and secondary, as the demand is requiring it?
Okay, thank you. I'll take another question before, and then we'll come to the panel. The panel can hold on to those thoughts. Andrew Phillips.
Hello. Okay, so my question for the panelists is just what role does the federal government, or what role should the federal government and the provincial government have in education of young Canadians on automation, AI, high technologies, and that are coming? That's my question.
Thank you. Let's see if I can get another one in. Jenny Midwinter, co-founder of Ottawa AI.
Hi, thank you for letting me ask my question. My question, as I said, I'm the co-founder of Ottawa AI and also the co-organizer of a large organization, Ottawa Machine Learning and Artificial Intelligence Meetup. We have over 1,900 members right now. So my question is around investment and supporting the investment in this really important sector. So recently we know there's been some investments made to foster our R&D community, especially our leaders in this area, to stay in the country. So we have Toronto, Montreal, I think Edmonton as well. So my question is around the choice and how is that those decisions are made to invest in those centers, what is happening with the other centers, and also how do we compare in this investment that we're doing here in Canada with regards to outside the world, like China and Russia. These are countries that are making billions and billions of dollars of investments in this area. Are we going to be left behind? Is this enough? Are we doing enough? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. And sorry, panelists, you got a lot of things to note here. One more, then I'll complete the floor. Kobe Harrington, I believe it is, a student at Carleton.
Hi. So my question is, when it comes to decisions that represent an interaction between a human and a robotic system, ultimately, where does the judgment lie if the machine has a solution that contradicts what might be wisdom or personal freedom of the individual?
Okay, back to the glass of wine, maybe. Okay, who wants to start on any of those? And just take the ones that you want. And why don't we go around? We'll start with Kristen. We'll go right through the four of you.
Sure. I'll make a couple of comments in response. First, in response to that last question, I think is an excellent question. And there we get into, at least through a legal lens, you get into questions of expertise. So where we have a robotic system or an AI system that has, let's say, better statistics. It's statistically, on average, it's accurate more often than the human decision maker. There's a legal push towards relying on that decision because, how do we meet the standard of care? So we look at the sort of, have you met your duty of care, your standard of care in terms of decision making, let's say in a medical situation? Well, to meet that standard of care, you want the best possible medical answer. And so if statistically the robot has been more accurate, there's a pressure to follow that decision. But I think you hit on a point that's important, which is, a human decision maker can sort of sit there and explain, this is why I think this is my decision, this is why I think we should take this course of action, whereas the artificial intelligence system may not be able to produce those kinds of reasons. And that puts us in a bit of a conundrum where we can understand why the human has made one decision, but we have a feeling that the robot might be more likely to be correct. Not guaranteed to be correct, but more likely. And so I think there's a challenge right now in terms of the legal treatment of that situation, where the pressure from courts would probably be towards the robot, even though we have a better understanding of the human decision. And just to touch on some of the earlier questions, and this is something that Goldie brought up actually in her introductory remarks, but I think both in terms of thinking about infrastructure, so how do we approach the infrastructural changes that will be needed as smart cities develop, and also in terms of investment, the question about investment. I think designing a robotics roadmap that sets out, what's Canada's strategy, what's Canada's plan in terms of where we have a value added in innovation, where we have a value added in law and regulation, that will really help to set the stage for those kinds of discussions.
Thank you. So maybe just answering two of the questions that were raised on the kind of interaction between humans and kind of robotics or software-based decision making. I think what you'll see as emerge is an evolution of those decisions being made together, but in a more efficient way. And so, for example, if a frequently cited example is machine learning being better at reading X-rays than radiologists. I don't think you're ever going to have a situation where a medical doctor is taken out of the patient treatment in this area, but perhaps the vast majority of the X-ray reading technology is done in an automated way, but the system is designed in a way to kind of flesh up or flesh out, examples where there is a need for extra human judgment, and at the end of the day, there's always that kind of fail-safe. And so I think you'll probably see that emerge as a best practice in this area. And then secondly, on the question about infrastructure, particularly in our cities, I think it's a really important one. There's an experiment going on in Toronto, which is where I'm from right now. Google and Sidewalk Labs has just been given a big chunk of the waterfront to kind of pilot and test out what a modern, smart, technologically advanced urban environment looks like. They've cited a lot of the technology that's been raised today. So I think as a Torontonian and as an urban dweller here in Canada, I think it's an example to look at and say, what can we learn from this, and where will mistakes be made, because we definitely need to add that layer of technology awareness to our urban planning and our understanding of how to deploy infrastructure across the country.
Okay. Nicholas?
Yes, so a few quick comments. First of all, first on the judgment and combination of human versus machine decisions. As Sean pointed out, I think the preferred model will be a combination of human and machine decisions being taken together. And we can look at the world of chess playing today, and it's a very instructive example. We have Deep Blue that beat Kasparov back in 1997, and we may think that the world has not evolved since, and machines are now much better than humans. But the real question is, can we play better chess? And if we look at the best chess players in the world today, it's neither a human, it's not a machine. It's actually a combination of human and machine playing together. And in that field, it's called a centaur. So a mix between a horse and a human. And that model is going to evolve more and more. I think will become prevalent in the way we make decisions. Maybe one final thought on Canada versus China, for example, in terms of investment. I think it is clear that China has a very clear strategy, at least at the national level. Some of you may have seen this past summer the national 2030 strategy put forward by the government of China, in which they are planning to invest 100 billion RMBs over the next few years to make China literally a world leader in all areas of AI. when we hear our governments in Canada putting forth a few $100 million, I mean, that's orders of magnitude less money than what the government of China is putting out. So I think we need an AI and robotics strategy at the national level, and we need the support from all levels of government to ensure that Canada remains competitive. We have amazing advantages in research institutions, and we have been quite bad as a country to have all this science and innovation percolate in the real world, and we need to become much better at it.
Okay, finally, Goldie.
Thank you. Maybe I'll start with the smart cities. As Sean was mentioning, there is an initiative in Toronto, and there's a Smart Cities Institute that's actually working on developing this in parallel to as we develop the technologies. So we work very closely with them. There's faculty at the University of Toronto in order to ensure that this technology gets integrated into that network. Funding, of course, we may not be able to compete with China in terms of the dollar amounts, but we do have several advantages. First, we do need this federal level robotics strategic plan. We don't have one. China has one, as I was mentioning, the US, Korea, Japan, European Union, you name it. There's a lot of countries that have already come together to make robotics a top priority. It is a disruptive technology, as we're talking about, and we need to do the same here. And there are several of us, and Kristen's been involved in this as well, working towards making sure we have that and bringing that to our government to make sure we don't lose out, because, as I was mentioning before, we do have the expertise. So we want to be able to get the dollar amounts. We may not be able to match China, but if we can find the initiatives we want to go after, then we have the expertise to do that here. And I think we can be a competitor, definitely, to China, the US, and Japan, and the European Union. The decisions are interactions between humans and robots. I'll just echo that. We are envisioning collaborative teams, as I was mentioning, the robots and humans together as a whole. We don't see just the robots. We see them really nicely integrated, and the decision making is a balance between the two. So you'll always have the human in the loop. And maybe I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Avant de conclure, je tiens à souligner la jeunesse de nos panélistes et l'expertise formidable qu'ils ont déjà, ce qui est très encourageant pour l'avenir. Je m'inquiète du fait qu'on n'a pas encore la possibilité, et je pense que ce ne sera pas souhaitable, d'avoir un robot coordonnateur des interventions gouvernementales. Je pense que ça devra être l'humain. Vous avez fait ressortir, tant par les questions des sénateurs de la salle et par vos réponses, tout le monde, je pense, a été très formidable. On a fait ressortir cette dualité entre les aspects humains et les aspects technologiques, robotiques, intelligence artificielle. L'importance d'une décision qui soit toujours équilibrée, mais en même temps, je pense aussi que, et en particulier les dernières questions, font ressortir que le gouvernement canadien, les gouvernements provinciaux en interface, tarde encore à être en avant-garde dans une stratégie canadienne, pan-canadienne, en matière d'intelligence artificielle et de robotique. Les enjeux de compétition internationale, les enjeux de législation et de réglementation à tous les niveaux demeurent encore très importants et il faut faire vraiment davantage. Au niveau de l'encouragement, la recherche, le financement, on en a parlé. Donc, je pense que notre conclusion, nous, entre autres sénateurs, c'est de retenir que ces enjeux méritent une considération prioritaire et davantage intensive, et ce sera notre rôle de faire circuler ce message. Alors, à vous tous, à vous toutes, grand merci dans l'assistance. Merci aux sénateurs qui ont l'habitude de questions pointues, recherchées. Encore une fois, ce matin, vous n'avez pas démenti votre réputation. Et je vais laisser la parole maintenant au sénateur Eagleton.
Well, my thanks also to all of our panelists and for all of you for being here. Our next Open Caucus will be on Wednesday, November 22nd. We'll be That'll be, in that week, we commemorate the Day of the Child, or Day of the Rights of the Child, so we will have a panel on the rights of the child being held on Wednesday, November 22nd, and with that, the meeting stands adjourned.